네, 안녕하십니까. 2022
Good
한반도
morning.
평화 포럼
This is the second day
프로그램
of the Korea Global Forum for Peace
후안 엔리케스
2022.
미래학자님의
We will begin
특별
with a
강연이
special
있겠습니다.
session or a
후안
special lecture by
엔리케스
Mr. Juan
미래학자님을
ENRIQUEZ.
만나보도록 하겠습니다.
Let's invite him to the stage for his lecture.
네, 후안 엔리케스님 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Dr. ENRIQUEZ, please start your lecture.
Well, good morning and greetings from San Francisco. It's a pleasure to be with you. I apologize for not being there in person, but I think we'll have fun. So let me share a few slides. And as we think about exactly what it is that allows us to progress over time and learn over time and judge each other in different ways over time, one has to think about the concept of evolution. And the first thing one might want to think about is, what is it that makes us so different from animals? We share a lot of our DNA, we share a lot of our genes, we share a lot of our genetic code with chimpanzees, we share a lot of it with other animals. And as you're thinking about that, the really big difference between an animal and a human being is we know how to teach people across time. So there may be animals that have language, there may be animals that sing, there may be animals that are able to deal with each other in an intelligent way. But what animals don't do is they don't accumulate knowledge across time. So when you see a map like this, basically what it's telling you is this is what we learned about Korea in 1500. And you're transmitting a lot of knowledge about what you knew and what you didn't know. And the next generation adds to that knowledge, and the next generation adds to that knowledge. And what I'd like you to think about is what happens when you change a map, what happens when you change the ability to see things and write things and transmit information. And what happens to society in terms of wealth? What happens to society in terms of power? What happens to society in terms of ethics? And all of those change as you change your ability to map, to teach, to write, to transmit information. So let me exemplify that. So one of the things that happened over the last few centuries is you enormously simplified how you transmit information. And at least in English, with 26 letters, you can tell everybody, this is what we understand happened last night, what happened last year, what happened a decade ago, what happened 500 years ago, what happened 10,000 years ago. And the really interesting thing is these notation systems, this ability to teach people things, has changed across time. And over the last 30 or 40 years, part of the secret of Korea's success has been the ability to adapt to new languages. So when you think of what's happened in South Korea began to adopt a very different notation system, and instead of writing just in Korean and Korean kanji, what started happening is they started writing in ones and zeros. So in English, if I sent you the first line of code here, you would receive a message that says, I love you. Now, if I change those ones and zeros that are in green for the ones that are in orange, then you would receive a message that says, I hate you. So you get a very different reaction depending on which line of code you send. And what's really interesting about this language, and the reason why this language has made South Korea so successful in changing its language, is because not only is every single word written, spoken, transmitted in Korean now in a two-letter alphabet, in a digital alphabet, but the same is true of Chinese, the same is true of French, of Spanish, of Aramaic, of Egyptian. Every language in the world now can be transmitted in written or spoken form in a digital format from one phone to another, from one television screen to another. And the impact of this has been to generate enormous amounts of wealth in the nations that taught their children and their businesses and their governments how to adapt from the original language that many of us grew up with speaking in our countries into the ones and zeros that people are speaking today. The second reason why this language is just so important is because not only do you transmit all words written and spoken, you also transmit every photograph. You can't do that if you're writing in kanjis or if you're writing in ABCs. It transmits every bit of music. You needed a separate notation system for that before. It can transmit any video, it can transmit every film. So you no longer need different notation systems, different transmission systems for music, for video, for film, for photographs, for words written and spoken. They all come into your phone because this language is so powerful. So because this language was so powerful, why weren't we using it before? Well, among other things, we hadn't really developed computers. So a 10 megabyte hard disk used to cost about $3,500. And to put that in perspective, that's 2 or 3 photographs that you take on your phone today. So not surprisingly, there wasn't a lot of digital photography going on 30 or 40 years ago. As this system progresses, if you had been able to buy 1 terabyte in this period, it would have cost you a lot of money. Fast forward. Now you can buy a terabyte in a USB for about $9. So as the price of these things comes down, halving in price every year, doubling in power, then what happens is the economies that adapt and adopt this particular language become dominant. They become companies that have companies like Samsung, companies that are globally dominant because they understood this transition from the original language into ones and zeros. And so as you're thinking about what this stuff means, there is not just a digital revolution going on today, there is also a revolution going on with life. So let me unpack that. What this means is, as you're thinking about life, Watson and Crick discovered that every life form is coded in what looks like a little spiral staircase. So this little spiral staircase is a molecule called DNA, and the steps on the staircase are one of 4 base pairs: adenine, threonine, guanine, cytosine. So every form of life is coded in this. If you're looking at a plant, it's coded in DNA. If you're looking at bacteria, it's coded in DNA. If you look at a dog, if you look at a cat, if you look at an elephant, if you look at a monkey, if you look at a human being, everything is coded in the same molecule. And it's the order of the molecules that determines whether you're this species or this species. So in essence, what we've learned to do over, say, 1990 through today is to decode the genetic code of all living things. So why does this code matter? Remember for a second those little lines of ones and zeros. If I send you this line of ones and zeros, then it's going to say, I love you. If I send you this line of ones and zeros, it's going to say, I hate you. If I send you this line of ones and zeros, it's going to be your favorite song. If I send you this line of ones and zeros, it's going to be a great picture of one of your children. I can alter those pictures and make them from color to black and white by altering some of those ones and zeros. And the effect is very different. Something very similar happens with life. Next time you go to the supermarket, pick up a fruit, pick up an apple, and think about what that apple does. That apple is the equivalent of a computer, but it happens to execute not photographs, not film, not books. It happens to execute a program called Make an Apple Tree. So when that apple falls to the ground, These lines of code, AATCAAGGG, mean, please build me a little root. And then the next line of code says AAACAA, and that means build me a little stem. And then GACCC, put a little leaf on that stem. And then AGCCC, grow me a little flower. And then eventually GCAAA, grow me another apple. And then have that apple grow another apple tree. So when you think about life code, what you're really thinking about is a sequence of this language saying, build me an apple tree. But in the same way as I can change those ones and zeros and say, I love you or I hate you, depending on the line, I can change the line in the code of an apple to say GCAAA, and that maybe turns that apple seed into an orange seed, or into a grapefruit seed, or into a lemon seed. And the same thing happens with human beings. So the difference between you and the person sitting next to you is about 1 out of 1,000 of these letters. So if you change the right 1 in 1,000 of these letters, you become the person who's sitting next to you today. So this code really matters. This is a really powerful code. And in the same way as we learn how to transmit information about our songs, about our habits, about our history, about our technology, now we're transmitting stories about life. And those stories really matter. Because in the same way as you can write a book or write an atlas or write a history or whatever, you can now think of life as code that can be mapped and can be programmed. And so again, part of the success of Korea over the last decades has been to take a population, educate that population in digital code, produce the instruments that use that digital code to make telephones, to make television sets, to make refrigerators, to make all kinds of things. And now what's happening is we're beginning to think of life as the next language. So you start with hieroglyphs and caves. You move to kanjis. You move to simplified language. You move to ones and zeros. And now you're moving towards life code. So what does this all mean? What this means is one of the companies that I was involved in and co-founded started thinking of very basic small cells as operating systems. So think of a very small cell as the equivalent of a computer chip. And so what we did in this picture is we took all of the gene code out of a cell, put in a different code, and made a different species. So why is that so important? Because it means that in the same way as you can program a computer chip to process your video games, or to process your films, or to send your love letters, or to send your business contracts, we can now process life code in the language of DNA, ATCG, instead of in ones and zeros, and turn one species into something else. And the reason why that is just so important in this whole system is because this is a system that reproduces itself. No matter how I program a cell phone in the morning, I will not have 1 billion cell phones that night. But if I program a cell or two, I can have a lot of cells very quickly. What's been happening with this is, again, it was very expensive. It took us, several years and several millions of dollars to get this initial result, to get this initial picture. But now what's beginning to happen is people are beginning to develop cellular platforms to make living machines. And so this is a programming of a cell to make vaccines, a programming of a cell to make gasoline, a programming of a cell to make textiles, a programming of a cell to store information. And again, it's becoming a faster, better, cheaper process. And when you're thinking about this, a second company that I helped co-found has created the equivalent of biological printers. So, we used to use laser desk printers to print out our documents or our spreadsheets or something, and it would be sitting next to the office desk and would print out these pages. And what Codex is now doing is it's taking the gene sequence, inserting it into cells, and pushing out programmable cells. So this is now becoming a scalable platform. This is now becoming something where you can decide which organism you want to build, what the purpose of this organism, and we're talking about microorganisms. We're not talking about printing animals yet. But as you're thinking about this, what this implies is that you're able to print life functions that reproduce. And you're beginning to do it on a scalable pipeline basis. And that is important because you can begin to standardize this. You can put the sequence in and get the product out. Is this perfect? No, it's not. Is it expensive? Yes, it is, but getting cheaper every year. And so what this implies in terms of the impact that you're seeing in speed is that the digital revolution is the line you see up above in light blue. And what that means is that the speed with which you adopted digital code for photographs, for computers, for music, for your love letters, etc., was halving in price every year and doubling in power, what they call Moore's Law. What you're seeing here in green is the speed with which the cost per genome sequenced is dropping. And what this is telling you has a whole series of implications for business. The first implication is, at the beginning, this was adopting and adapting and producing information about the same rate as computers, as what we saw over the last 30 or 40 years with digital world. And then about 2007, 2008, the cost dropped off a cliff. And it got cheaper faster, and it got cheaper faster, and it got cheaper faster, faster than happened with computers. And this has real implications for business. One implication is we cannot build computers fast enough to store this information. It overwhelms computer systems. The second implication of this is it's very hard to store and transmit this data because our systems are built for the light blue line, not for the light green line. And so, again, the implication of this is it forces change, not just in biology, not just in medicine, but across any system that uses a living thing. It can force changes in textiles. It can force changes in medicine. It can force changes in manufacturing. It can force changes in telephone systems. It can force changes in information systems. And this is just really important to understand. So the old biology used to basically be a reactive science. You would watch what happened, and then you would react and try the experiment again. And basically, you were watching what nature did and trying to build a penicillin, or watch what nature did and try and understand the behavior of an animal. The new biology is a different system. The new biology doesn't just observe what's happening, it builds on a different evolutionary track what you want to make. So it is not nature that is choosing, that is naturally selecting. It is humans who are saying, you know what, I'm going to take this in a very different direction from what nature has been doing. I am going to do this so that I get yogurt. I'm going to do this so I get this kind of sake. I'm going to do this so I get this kind of fruit wine. I'm going to do this so that I get this type of medicine. And that is a very different system. Why is this so important? Because if you can program bacteria, if you can modify fruit, eventually what you can do is you can understand the gene code that makes you, me, and everybody else around us. And we call that the human gene code, the human genome. And what happened starting in the year 2000 through today is that it's been getting faster, better, cheaper to read the gene code, not just of one individual, but of hundreds of thousands or millions of individuals. And again, that gene code is really important because that gene code makes you, you. So think about a child. A child is born with no teeth. A child grows a full set of teeth. And then they start to fall out, and you leave the child a little candy or you leave something every time a tooth falls out. And then eventually the teeth grow back. And the interesting thing is, what this is telling you is human beings know how to make a full set of teeth in their body. In fact, they know how to make a full set of teeth twice. But unlike sharks and lawyers, if a human being loses a tooth as an adult, that tooth does not grow back. But here's what's interesting. If you know the gene code sequence, the instructions in your body to grow a tooth, then maybe you can grow a third tooth. Because after all, the instructions necessary to grow teeth in your body have already been executed once and twice. So why can't you do it a third time? Your body knows how to do that. And if your body knows how to do that, it's not just teeth you're talking about. It turns out that every organ in your body is made by the code of the human genome. So you have already made 2 kidneys. Your body knows how to make kidneys. Why can't your body grow a third kidney or a fourth? Your body knows how to regrow bones when they break. Why can't it regrow cartilage or your nose or your ears? Because again, the gene code necessary, the instruction set necessary to make your body parts is already a part of each one of your cells. So every one of your cells knows how to make every part of your body. And in the measure that we begin to understand what the instruction set is that makes part of your body, that makes a kidney, that makes a liver, that makes a stomach, we are going to be able to execute that code again. And that is just really important. And are we there yet? No, we're not there yet. But as Roy Amara in the Institute for the Future used to say, we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run and underestimate its effect in the long run. And there was a lot of talk about the human genome, and there was a lot of talk about genomics, and there was a lot of talk about new medicines, and then we all got bored with it. Except that this is a system that is doubling in power, not every year, but every few months. And the price is halving. And so you don't see it, you don't see it, you don't see it, and then suddenly it seems to appear out of nowhere. This is really important for debates about the future of nations, about what you do with nations that are far behind, what you do with nations that are far ahead, how you think about unifying the education of folks, how you think about understanding the viewpoints of other people. Because we all start from the viewpoint that we know right, and if you don't agree with me, you're wrong. And sometimes we are right, and sometimes we are not. And the strange thing about this is because technology is so powerful, because it moves so quickly, it can fundamentally change our notion of what we think is right and what we think is wrong. And so we can start out with the notion of I'm right and you're ignorant. But that is a very dangerous thing to do because the rules may change over time, especially during a time when technology is exponential. and especially because ethics and right and wrong may begin to change in exponential ways. So you may be brought up and taught by a leader or a system or an education or your peers that X is right. And it may turn out that X is not only wrong, but the rules have changed really substantially in terms of what you can do and what you can't. That sounds very abstract, so let me unpack this a little bit. If you don't believe that our notion of right and wrong changes over time, then you don't study history. Because when you see what the state religion used to tell you to do, when you think about what the scientists or the astronomers in a society told you to do, when you think about what the most powerful leaders told you to do, that you had to do because otherwise the country would not survive, there was a period where they did human sacrifice. And the logic of that human sacrifice was, if we don't kill these people, the sun will not rise. If there is not a sacrifice, the rains will not come. And of course today, because we know a lot more about science, about astronomy, about weather, about climate, we now look back on this and think that is a really stupid thing. But at that point, it was taught at the right thing. And of course, same is true of religion. There have been a lot of religions in the world. Most religions have gone extinct. So when you go to an archaeology museum, when you go to a history museum, a lot of what you're looking at is monuments to dead gods. This is the god of water. This is the plumed serpent. This is Zeus. This is Zarathustra. A lot of those gods and a lot of those religions have disappeared. And one of the things that religions used to do is they used to say, if you don't agree with me, if you don't follow my precepts, if you don't respect me, if you don't pay me, I will burn you in the town square as a heretic. I will torture you. I will murder you. And that was considered okay. And it was considered okay by the religious authorities. It was considered okay by the judicial authorities. It was considered okay by the government authorities. And today it looks absolutely savage to us and absolutely wrong. Not that long ago, people used to take their children and dress up in their fancy clothes to watch the guillotine murder people in the squares of Paris. And there was a great spectacle and people would show off the head. And of course, all of us look at that today and say, who were these savages? That is so wrong. So what I want you to understand as you judge other people, as you try and reconcile with other people, is that they can have very different notions of what is right and what is wrong. They can be educated in a very different way from us. But there is sometimes a convergence as our societies move forward, where people begin to recognize that what they were taught, what they believed, what they were brought up with, is just fundamentally wrong. And in some cases, evil. I don't just mean that technology changes things in horrible ways. I actually mean to imply that technology changes things sometimes in ways that we consider far better. Because what technology does is it gives you the ability to do things at a bigger scale, to be more generous with those who didn't have a lot. And let me use an extreme example of this. Every civilization across time has had slaves at some point. So the US certainly had slaves, Britain had slaves, China had slaves, Korea had slaves, Japan had slaves. You call them different things, but there was a control over another person's body, usually for life. And that was true in Africa, that was true in Asia, that was true in Europe, that was true in the Americas. Why did slavery go away in most countries in less than a century? I understand there's still slavery today, but it is not considered legal, it is not considered right, it is not considered something that you accept anywhere. Why did this go away after tens of thousands of years? And again, part of the answer there has to do with technology. So if you wanted to launch a warship, if you wanted to invade a neighboring country, often what you would do is you would power your warships with slaves. And why did this change? And why did it change so radically? Well, among other things, it started to change in the 1800s and about the mid-1800s because people started using things like oil. And oil as a technology brings into a single barrel refined oil about 5 to 10 years of human labor. So when you burn a barrel of oil, in essence, you're taking the work that, a human being would do over 5 years. And when you tie that to machinery, then you've got thousands or tens of thousands of horsepower. And all of a sudden, you have so much energy that you no longer need to go and invade the neighbor, enslave the rowers, because when you fly across the Pacific and you fly on these jet engines, each of these jet engines is the equivalent of 160,000 people rowing that airplane across the Pacific. So a 2-engine plane, has about the work output of about 320,000 people. And it would be absolutely impossible to enslave that many people and get them to work together to move you at that speed. It makes absolutely no sense. And so slavery begins to go away, and now has gone away in most of the world because it's far more efficient to use gasoline. It's far more efficient to use oil. It's far more efficient to use gas. It's far more efficient to use the labor of machines than the labor of humans. And over the course of a very short period of time, what ends up happening is lifespan goes up in Africa, lifespan goes up in Asia, lifespan goes up in the Americas, lifespan goes up in Europe. The brutality of those societies starts coming down, and a behavior that you and I and anybody else in this room can't justify, which is enslaving people, goes away. But it goes away after tens of thousands of years of being practiced by a lot of societies. And the notion that it is okay or not okay, but tolerable to have slaves is now anathema to all of us. It's not just slavery that has been changing. It has also been things like sex. So when you think about sex, think about how your grandparents thought about sex versus how you think about sex. And let's imagine for a second that we had a time machine and we brought back grandpa and grandma, not as grandpa and grandma, but as 20-something-year-olds. And we talked about what in the US is called the birds and the bees, which is basically sex. So your grandparents probably got married quite young, so they knew quite a bit about sex, but it was very, very different in terms of what they thought was right and wrong. Let's imagine for a second that you talked about birth control. Birth control is really new. Yes, there used to be birth control, but it wasn't effective. Usually it failed, and usually it was frowned upon, especially if you were unmarried. And now women are empowered to take control of their bodies and their reproductive cycles. But I want you to understand just how different that is today from 2 generations ago. If you went to your parents or your grandparents and said, we can have all the sex we want and never have a child, that would have seemed like witchcraft to them. it would have seemed completely unnatural and wrong. And then you go on and you say, and oh, by the way, because I want to do a career, or because I want a doctorate, or because my husband and I are not living in the same city, I would like to do in vitro fertilization. And your grandparents would look at you and say, now, just exactly what is in vitro fertilization? Well, it means that you can take an egg and a sperm and mix them together in a petri dish. And so think about that for a second in your grandparents' terms. What you're telling your grandparents is you do not physically have to touch each other to conceive a child. You don't have to be in the same room to conceive a child. You don't have to be in the same city or country to conceive a child. And again, that is something that would have seemed absolutely wrong, like witchcraft, like something completely unnatural. And there are probably people you know who believe that today. But most young people aren't there. Most young people have changed their notion of what is right and wrong in these terms. Then there's the issue of freezing eggs. So you can freeze an egg that's fertilized, and you can have a surrogate mother. And what does that mean? Well, that means that you can have identical twins who are born 20 years apart, 30 years apart. So what I'm telling you is the sex and the reproductive rules of right and wrong that your grandparents thought about as this is the way things are in the most basic of functioning of humans in reproduction have completely changed. And they've completely changed our notion of what is right, what is wrong, and what is acceptable, and how your grandparents were taught, do this, don't do that, and what you do today. And as you think about sex in the future, as technology accelerates, it is very likely that your grandchildren are going to do things or accept things that are completely wrong seeming to you. So you can sit there and say, I know right from wrong, but you have to have a little bit of a self-reflection thinking, what if technology changes the rules? What if technology changes what we can do? What if technology changes our notion of right and wrong? So as you move forward, you're beginning to be able to transplant uterus. And maybe women who are much older may be able to have children. You are also beginning to have the ability to have an animal carried to term outside the body. So you take a Ziploc bag and you grow a little cow or a little sheep inside it. And it doesn't have to be inside a mother's body. And, you know, in a few years, this will make for a very efficient neonatal unit. So if a baby is born too early, you can create the equivalent of a mother's body without the baby having to stay inside the mother and put both of them at risk. But you could also see a period where a generation or two from now, a mother may choose not to carry the baby inside the body, something that I probably wouldn't like, something that you may not like, something that you and I would consider, that doesn't sound right, but which would be natural and normal in a generation or two. As it becomes safer, as it becomes cheaper, as it becomes easier to do things, and also do things like treat a baby, take out some of the cancer genes. And as you think about genetic modification of children, today we would probably say, do not do that except as a last resort for a deadly disease. But again, as things become faster, better, cheaper, it may be that you're looking at these technologies and saying, hey, your grandkids, how dare you not have taken out the KRAS gene, the P53 gene? You could have edited my genome. I now have cancer because you were backward and ignorant. And these are complicated debates because it's taking things that we think are fundamental and right and wrong and perhaps flipping the logic 180 degrees. And this is going to become more and more of an issue as we do brain research. Because right now, the limit to longevity is the brain. Basically, this is you, and the rest of you is just packaging. Let me unpack that statement. If you lose an arm, it's still you. If you lose a kidney, it's still you. If you lose your eyesight, it's still you. If you lose your brain, it's no longer you. So as we think about how are human beings going to live 120 years, 140 years, 200 years, you're going to have to get to the brain, you're going to have to get to reproducing the brain, and then you've got some really complicated questions about, should I download my memories? Should I download my thoughts? Should I erase thoughts? Should I induce thoughts? Who has the right to do that? And these are debates that are not that far off in terms of some of the initial very rough technologies. You know, they're a generation or two out. Let me come back to what this means for countries, what this means for unifying countries, what this means for understanding people who think very differently from what we do. If you understand our notion of right and wrong can fundamentally change across time, we have to use two words that are not used very much today in such polarized times. And those words are humility and forgiveness. As we judge the past, as we judge what people did, there are people who thought things and did things which are horrendous in retrospect. They are unjustifiable. They should not have been done. It is under no circumstances okay to have enslaved people, to have murdered people for religion, to have sacrificed human beings. But you also have to understand that a lot of people from today placed in that context may have done something similar because that is the way they were educated. That is what the rules said. That is what the state said. That is what their peers said. That's what their teachers said. So as we judge people, let's use a little bit of humility and forgiveness and understand that people and their notions of right and wrong can change across time. And this is incredibly important if you're going to take people who think very differently and begin to converge the next generations. And you saw that in the unification of Germany and East Germany. You see it in countries that become successful because they understand how to take people who think differently and bring them along into a common project. And the other thing that this does, which is really important, is it also allows us to judge the few people who are truly evil. Because sometimes people who are truly evil and cruel hide under the banner of, well, we all thought that. And there is a responsibility for those who promote gratuitous violence, for those who are deliberately oppressive, for those who are murderous, to be called to account. But calling the leadership to account is different from calling a people to account. And as we judge people, you have to judge the circumstances in which they were acting and their leadership. And you have to apply a little bit of humility and forgiveness and understand that people can change their notion of right and wrong across time, that the next generations can come on board changing 180 degrees, and that that is absolutely essential for a country to become stronger and more united. for a country to survive across time, because it's very easy to divide. It's very easy to destroy. But we have opportunities previous generations never had. We have options previous generations never had. We've learned, and as we've learned, we've quit doing things that were fundamentally wrong. Does that justify the people who were doing things that fundamentally wrong? No, it doesn't. It does not justify slavery. It does not justify human sacrifice. But it gives us hope that we can change. It gives us hope that the next generations can be better than us. It gives us hope that technology will give us instruments that will allow us to live better lives. So let's think about these instruments. Let's think about how we judge each other with a little bit more humility and forgiveness. And that is all I had to say. So thank you very, very much for listening to me. And I wish you a happy, more prosperous, smarter next generations. I hope they're better than we are. Thank you very much.
네, 그럼 이상으로 특별 강연을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 다음 세션은 10시 40분부터
Sir
시작됩니다.
Juan ENRIQUEZ, the next session will begin at
감사합니다.
10:40. We ask you to come back to the event hall by that time. Thank you.